Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Crapo, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Peters, no. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Kane, no. Ms. Murkowski, no. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Ms. McSally, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Ms. Harris, no. Ms. Rosen, no. Mr. Alexander, aye. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Schatz, no. Mr. Romney, no. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. But I will hear you from now. Yeah. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Risch, aye. Yeah. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. King, no. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Langford. Aye. Mrs. Capito. Aye. Mr. Carper. No. Mr. Heinrich, no.
Yeah, that's right.
Mr. Menendez. No. Mr. Toomey. Aye. Mr. Shelby, aye. No. Mr. Schumer, no.
Does any senator in the chamber wish to change his or her vote? If not, the yeas are 50, the nays are 48. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this amendment, the amendment is not agreed to. The clerk will read the title of the bill for the third time.
H.R. 6201, an act making emergency supplemental appropriations for the fiscal year ending September 30, 2020, and for other purposes.
The question occurs on passage of the bill. Is there a sufficient second? Appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Carden, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mrs. Leffler, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Bennett, Blunt, Bozeman, Cantwell, Cardin, Cassidy, Collins, Coons, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Daines, Duckworth, Gillibrand, Graham, Grassley, Hassan, Heidsmith, Kane, Kennedy, Leahy, Menendez, Murray, Perdue, Peters, Reed, Romney, Rosen, Rubio, Shaheen, Shelby, Sinema, Smith, Thune, Tillis, Warner, Warren, Wicker, Young. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. King, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Lankford, Lee, Paul, Scott of South Carolina. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mrs. Capito, aye. Ms. McSally. Aye. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Ms. Harris, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Braun, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Mrs. Blackburn, no. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Burr, aye. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Udall, aye. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Jones, aye. Mr. Enzi, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Alexander. Mr. Alexander, aye. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Sass. Mr. Sass, no. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mrs. Leffler. Mrs. Leffler, aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Johnson, Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. McConnell, Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Toomey, Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Portman, Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Cruz. Aye. Mr. Risch. Aye.
Is any member in the chamber wishing to vote or change their vote? Seeing none, the ayes are 90, the nays are 8. The bill is passed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table.
Madam President,
The Majority Leader.
we just passed this bill that came over from the House. It's on the way to the President. a very important first step, which we're calling Phase 2. We'll continue to work on the next bill to respond to the crisis. And I want to repeat again, the Senate's going to stay in session until we finish Phase 3, the next bill, and send it over to the House. Republicans hope shortly to have a consolidated position along with the administration. Then we intend to sit down with our Democratic colleagues, see what we can agree to, and I would recommend senators stay around, close. Just how long it will take to get through these steps is unclear, but as everyone knows, we are moving rapidly because the situation demands it.
Madam President,
Senator from Oklahoma.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Three months ago, no one in the country, in fact, no one in the world, had heard the term COVID-19. The term coronavirus was around, but most folks didn't use that because it was connected to SARS or to MERS in the past. But in December of 2019, an infection started in China, and it spread rapidly through the Wuhan region. And by January, there were thousands of people affected before most of the world even knew it existed. Now almost every country in the world has infections. We have hundreds of thousands of people that have had contact with this virus. And unfortunately, we've lost thousands of people worldwide. In the United States, the numbers continue to increase because we're continuing to increase the number of people that we can actually test. Fortunately, the vast majority of the people who get this virus have little to no symptoms. It's cold, it's a mild flu to them. But for our vulnerable populations, our elderly populations, those with heart issues and lung issues, smokers, diabetics, this can be a very, very serious thing. And the challenge that we face in our healthcare is that for every person that walks in to get tested, they're face-to-face with one of our healthcare workers, especially in rural areas of our state, that may be the only healthcare professional for that entire county. And if that person who has not been vaccinated as well, because there is no vaccine yet, if that person is not able to serve the rest of the population, a bad health situation becomes even worse because of diminishing care. We as Americans are taking this seriously, as we should. We're paying attention. There's a younger population that's spending time trying to be able to get away from other individuals, to be able to self-isolate, self-quarantine, to be able to get social distancing is the new term, to be able to find some way to not be close to someone else so you don't accidentally pass the virus on. Because though the virus may be within them and they're not personally, physically affected much, the effect of someone else could be pretty dramatic. So out of respect for others, to try to manage that distance and to be attentive to that. There's been multiple actions from the government over the past several months, both travel bans that we all know very much about, starting with China and now in multiple areas of the world. Lots of encouragement to be able to limit gatherings, first to 250 and then to 50 and now to 10. And now a series of just keep social distancing to be able to make sure you're aware of that. There's been emergency declarations that have been done. CMS has changed coverage to, as recently as yesterday, on dealing with issues like telehealth, making sure that individuals that may have other care needs don't have to actually go into a healthcare professional for their fear of who else is sitting in the waiting room, but then get access to telehealth, a much needed change. The FDA has been very aggressive in giving access to different states to be able to do their own testing regimens. CDC has been active in trying to be able to get to a point where they can get a testing system that can actually get out to the entire country. The challenge was early on, many other countries did tests and developed tests with a high false positive rate. CDC was very focused on trying to get as accurate as they possibly could. That meant it took longer, and we don't have the tests out. The tests are more accurate, but we don't have the testing numbers that we need at the moment that we needed it, which was last week. So now we're still struggling to be able to catch up on testing all over the country. Multiple other labs, multiple universities are also coming on board. In fact, it's interesting, multiple other countries are also developing their own testing processes. In the days ahead, we will be able to catch up on the testing that any American could be able to get testing, but for now, it's limited. In states like my state in Oklahoma, where the virus is beginning its acceleration, we were late to actually get to the virus coming to Oklahoma, but now the virus is there, it starts to accelerate. And testing is exceptionally important to us, as it is to everyone else. The Department of Transportation is engaged on things like waivers for hours of service to allow the movement of goods all over the country, dealing with livestock and with food. There's been a big push from just about every retailer in the country to make sure they're cleaning facilities more and being open and accessible, doing hours early in the morning for those in the most vulnerable population so they're not shopping with people that may have the virus and don't even know it. There's been a shift around the entire country to encourage people to telework or to be able to find ways to be able to separate out in their place of work. All of these things have occurred just in the last few months. Beginning again to say, 3 months ago, none of us knew this term or this virus existed. All this has happened extremely rapidly. 3 weeks ago, Congress and the President agreed on a proposal. It was a wide bipartisan proposal to be able to deal with additional funding for testing, additional funding for the vaccine development, additional funding for state and local departments of health to be able to make sure they're taking care of that. My own state in Oklahoma has already received almost $7 million to be able to help in what's happening in our county, and we are in desperate need of those dollars to be able to get that done. Vaccine development is already in human trials now. It's in phase 1. It will take multiple months to be able to get that done, but we have already begun that process, and that's important to us. The bill that was on the floor today dealt with multiple helpful things. It expands SNAP, what some people still call food stamps, but it's supplemental nutrition. It's assistance for those families. It's an expansion of that. It also deals with unemployment insurance benefits, be able to make sure those are staying consistent and those get extended out to people that are going to need it, because in the past week, unemployment has dramatically increased all over the country. And in the days ahead, when we'll be able to see the numbers, we'll see the difference of what's happened this week versus the week before versus the week before that. The struggle is my phones have been filled with one other element that's in that bill, and that deals with a mandate on small businesses for sick leave. Small businesses in my state are closed. Many retailers and restaurants, many small businesses are really struggling with how they're going to pay for this when they have no income coming in right now. They're hearing the promise of a federal reimbursement coming to them, but they don't know when that's coming, and they're literally teetering on the edge right now. And their struggle is, please don't do something that pushes us over the edge. We need help, but we don't need a bureaucracy that's going to be slow to respond, or a way that's actually going to get us some help, but help that comes to us too late. In these terrifying words that I've heard from multiple employers, I cannot make it with that structure. I'm going to have to lay people off and hope to be able to hire them back when this all ends. For those families that are laid off and in unemployment now, this is a very different day for them. And my fear is some of what pushed some of those individuals over the edge into unemployment was a nudge to say, we're going to add one more mandate to you at your worst possible economic moment. The first principle that we should have as a Congress is do no harm. We need to step in and help those folks that need help. Now, there's lots of ideas being bantered around right now in the Senate and the House from both sides of the aisle to try to figure out how we can get help as rapidly as we can to as many people as we can. This is a moment unlike what we have seen before, where it's not that the economy is crashing because of some economic foundation that's not there. It is fear and panic that's global, that literally we're struggling with what if, and the CDC and our own governments saying to employers, it would be best if you closed for a season. And they, being good citizens and good neighbors, quite frankly, are complying with that for fear of their own business and of their own employees. I finished my day yesterday, late last night, talking to a small business owner in Oklahoma who relayed to me what he's going through right now and the struggles that he's having keeping the doors open. And quite frankly, he was fairly blunt with me to say, the things that are being passed in the bill tomorrow will affect me, but my competitors that are big companies, it doesn't affect them. And so it's already hard enough for me as a small business to compete with them. Now I have a new mandate on me that's not a mandate on them. And it makes it even harder. And I don't think I'll have the cash flow to be able to make this work. Towards the end of the conversation, he paused and literally began to cry. And he pulled himself together and said, I'm having to call people and tell them I don't have hours for you next week. And these are people I care about. We need to take action. But we need to take action that helps people keep their jobs, helps people stay employed, and helps us deal with the dip in the economy right now to help them pull back out. My fear is we didn't do that just now. We might have just made it worse. There are important things for us to do, and many of those things we're working on this week. We have got to get help to as many people as we can, as fast as we can. And it is my hope the Senate will continue to stay in session, as the leader has already said and promised that it would, until we actually come to some proposals where we have wide bipartisan agreement that get help rapidly to people that need the help the most. Those workers, those individuals that are struggling, those folks that are hourly, those folks that are waiters and waitresses, those folks that work at the coffee shop and own the coffee shop, those folks in retail locations that are shut down. They need us to stand with them, and this is our moment to do it. Let's do it together. With that, I yield the floor.
From Massachusetts.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I want to start my remarks by saying to the people of Massachusetts and families all across the country, many of you are making big sacrifices, quarantining yourselves, postponing or canceling major events, dealing with closed schools and daycare. We are grateful. Right now, our primary goal needs to be to slow the spread of this virus. And we all share in that responsibility. And so we thank